I pay my respects to the first peoples of this place, and particularly for the way in which they have sustained the story of God in this space. A story that you and I are forced to wrestle with as Christians when we acknowledge that God has another story of this land. During the recent debates that have happened around the place around gambling machines and poker machines, and the question of gaming cards and cashless cards and the impact on poor people and criminal activity, the Premier of New South Wales said that the decision he had made to introduce those cashless cards had nothing to do with his Catholic faith. The previous Prime Minister, a committed Pentecostal Christian, regularly said that his Christian faith had nothing to do with the way in which he acted in Parliament or the decisions that he made. Now, I think at one level what they were both trying to say to us was that the decisions they made as Christians, they weren't trying to impose on everybody else in the world. I think the other thing they were doing was responding to a conversation in our community that says that decisions should be made on the basis of evidence and on rationality, and they shouldn't be made on the basis of somebody's own personal belief. There's a subtle assumption in there that there's such a thing as a value-free conversation. But the third thing, and it's the thing that's most crucial to us this morning, is the assumption that faith is simply a set of beliefs that have no implications for the very character of our life or for the way in which we can engage in public life or the life of work. The Premier actually worked that out because about a week after he made his declaration, he said he was mistaken, that in fact his decision had been shaped by the fact of the teachings of the Catholic Church around the need to care for the poor and the marginalised. You and I live in the midst of stories, in books, in music, in multiple media forms of different kinds, in political speeches and commentaries, in spaces in public life, in all sorts of conversations and worlds. We live in the midst of stories that explain and justify why the world is the way it is, and mostly why the world couldn't be any better, particularly if it's a story told by somebody with a fair bit of power. They're stories that shape our values, our priorities, our loyalties, and our assumptions about how it is that you and I are supposed to inhabit the world in which we live. There is no story-free space, and therefore there is no free space where we are not required to wrestle with our choices and our values and our decisions about how we will live and who we will live with. That means for you and I as Christians, we are constantly trying to negotiate a space in the world between the story of Jesus and that multitude of stories that bombard us all the time. Our society tells us that it ought to be possible to live in this community with the values of a liberal, conservative, and individualistic society and still hang on to our faith. Well, I want to tell you this morning, I don't think that's so. I was invited because this is the beginning of the academic year. And I want to say to you at the beginning, as people immerse themselves in study, in teaching, in research, in learning in all sorts of spaces around the community, as people immerse themselves in new and old relationships, The question is, I think, for us, what is the relationship between education and discipleship? And how does the vocation that we choose for ourselves reflect that education and that discipleship? It's a conversation that returns us to the beginning of the conversation. Is faith simply a statement of belief, the capacity to stand up in front of your community and say, Jesus is Lord? Or is there something else to our faith? Something that's deeply about the practices of life and the way in which we inhabit the world in which we live. Think about this. In the early church, it took 2 to 3 years to be baptised. It was a lengthy period of learning and formation, of discovering the nature of Jesus, the life of the church, and how you were meant to live in the world. And the reason it took that long was that the confession that Jesus is Lord was a statement of deep loyalty and a statement about the way in which people actually inhabit the world. It was a statement that said that as a Christian, you are to live a radically different form of life than the world in which you live, and the loyalties that and the things that you do are simply different. So, for example, in that world, people couldn't take an oath to the emperor. And if you couldn't take an oath to the emperor, you couldn't go to public office. You couldn't join the military. It was a community that tried really hard to include the excluded, to break down class barriers and social barriers, that tried to care for the poorest. It was a community that held that Jesus is Lord is actually a counter-narrative to the claim of an emperor who said that he was Lord of the whole heavens and earth. To be a Christian was a risky business, and it takes time to form people to live in the midst of risky business. The community, the church, knew that it took that kind of time, and it knew that it took prayer and support and encouragement and the existence of a community of people who held the story of Jesus accurately and well and sustained people in the midst of that kind of life. Discipleship is shaped by the companions we choose for the journey. It's shaped by the people that we decide to sit down with, to listen to try to help us understand the state of the world in which we live. It depends on the social and political location that you and I choose and whose voices we hear and who we try to enable to have a voice in the world. I want to say to you this morning that education really matters at all kind of levels of life. But it helps us understand who we are, and it helps us understand the world in which we live. It holds out for us the promise that we can actually contribute to the world in maybe some quite extraordinary ways. And I want to say to you, particularly for those who are beginning on the journey or continuing on the journey of university education or different stages in your schooling, that ideas actually matter. They matter because they stretch us and help us imagine things that we wouldn't otherwise imagine. You know, when I was at university, it was a long time ago when people wrote on stone tablets and stuff, but when I was at university, my friends in the fellowship that I belonged to, we spent endless hours over many months debating whether you could hide a leaking pen in an invisible pocket. Now, I know it's stupid, but in a sense, that conversation shaped and moulded and made me in part the kind of person that I am and the kind of thinker that I have become. But those debates wouldn't have mattered. Those esoteric and strange debates would not have mattered without the other ones. Around the question of where would I stand in the struggle over land rights? Where would I locate myself in relation to the African National Congress office in Sydney, where I was, and its struggle against apartheid? What would I say about the life of the Palestinians? How would I walk with people who had been thrown from power in the first coup in Fiji? How would I help with gun control? By the way, Gun Control New South Wales's office was my office in the Assembly of the Uniting Church. How would I support the advent of the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, or the beginning of the preamble? What voice would I contribute to climate change? And at present, what voice would I contribute to the voice to Parliament, to truth-telling and treating? There are two conversations going on in your life and mine. The biblical witness is that at its heart, Christian life is a radical choice about both God, revealed in Jesus Christ, and the life that we choose to live to give expression to that voice. You see, the 10 Commandments that we read this morning are not simply an abstract set of laws. The really important part of the 10 Commandments are the opening words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the life of slavery. This is who the people are. This is the story that shapes their life. The commandments say, if you believe this about God, if you are this kind of people, then here's some wisdom about how you give expression to that, not just as individuals, as we tend to believe, but as a community. This is the shape of your life that gives expression to the story of God with you. James, in his letter, says, to the horror of Luther quite often and others, that faith without works is dead. What does faith mean, he says, if you don't care for your neighbours? And Matthew, in the Gospel reading, backs it up the same way. Words can be empty things. He says to his community, you can get up in front of us each Sunday and confess that Jesus is Lord, but if you have made no effort to do the will of the Father, they're empty words. And it's astounding. He said, even if you prophesy, even if you heal, even if you do grand works, if you do not actually care for God's people as your neighbours, then it's all empty and meaningless thing. That's what the early church knew. That's why it took the time. It knew that it took worship and prayer and community to do these things. That's why education matters. It's one of the reasons why education matters. It helps us understand. It contributes to our understanding of the world in which we live. It helps us sort out what it means to follow Jesus in 2003 in this space and not just in some abstract kind of space. And it helps us to oppose the falsehoods and the lies that people with power hide behind as they try to rob people of life and the possibilities of well-being. So I want to say to those of you who are beginning the academic year, whether as teachers, as students, as researchers, or whatever place you have in that space, that the challenge of the world for Christians is to read against the grain. That your challenge is to hold to the story of Jesus, who cares for people on the edge of life, and to ask yourself, in my studies and my work and my life, if I do this, who will benefit? And who will pay the cost? How will your life at school and university and the choices that you make emerge out of the struggle between the Christian story and the multitudes of stories that you will hear in the space that you are? What will shape the core of your discipleship and your life? A couple of examples, and there's a lot left out and a lot of things left going. But if you're studying law, who will you protect? Who will you commit to give voice to? And how will you respond to those who close off voices? If you study economics, whose interest will you support? What will you say about an economic system that continually marginalises people, that deliberately keeps people poor and discourages people from joining trade unions that would help sustain the events of their life? If you study history, from whose perspective will you study? Please don't tell me there is none. The history wars in Australia in recent years should have taught us there is no neutral space. There is only a space where we sit with some people and not with others. And if you're concerned with literature or art or music or dance, whose story will you tell? And if you're studying medicine or public policy or engineering, imagine your own questions, because they're there. So here's the challenge for you for the year. How does your decision to journey with Jesus, who stood on the margins of life, who welcomes strangers and those who are left out, how will you, as you seek to give voice to those without voice, how will that shape the place where you study and work and live? And not just after the day of study and research and work is done, as an extra to your discipleship, but how will those choices actually shape your study, your teaching, your research, your life in those places? I encourage you to make the most of this community. Build opportunities to encourage each other. Pray for each other. Engage in Bible study together. Join together in acts of discipleship. It's hard to read against the grain on your own. My wish and prayer for you each is that as this year unfolds, your place of education, wherever it is, may be a place that contributes to your formation as a follower of the living Christ, and that your capacity to live and witness may be enriched by that place and by him.